Hey, so good morning and hello everyone and welcome back. Today is going to be a bit of a different video where I'm going to be talking about how you can we could improve railways and Amtrak in this country at whole rather than talking about the historical context of a route or a given phenomena in the pre-Amtrak railways. And in a future video, I'll be going over deregulation and how that kind of gave us the situation we have now. And yeah, I'm doing this out of order, at least for what I would consider out of order, so just kind of gonna roll with this because time is of the essence, I guess, in, well, the grand political scheme of things. So one of the main ways the government could improve how the railways work would be to basically buy the right-of-ways of the Class 1 railroads and transfer them to state trust funds like we have with the highways, and then divide the country up into about 3 different sectors with 3 operators each, with 1 local operator per state, and heavily modernize the rights-of-way of these formerly private railroads. And on top of this, since the railways would in this case be nationalized, using the traffic control ability that one operator, or at least one owner of the railways would have, to basically make more capacity for Amtrak and other passenger services. So we're going to be going into that a little bit today. So currently the Class 1 railroads in the U.S. own approximately 93,000 miles of track. These are in various states of repair, but most of the track isn't in a good state of repair. Most railways are single-tracked, and the average speed is hovering around 38 miles per hour. The railways would need to be upgraded to at least 60 miles per hour as per the DOT to handle high-priority shipments. This means that the railways need to be upgraded to at least Class 4 track consistently across the United States, which is meaning passenger trains would be able to go up to 80 miles an hour. And also this puts us into the perspective of modern technology. Since PTC, where positive train control is needed, the maximum speed of trains would probably go up to about 90 miles an hour for passenger trains, and I can't remember if it's 70 or 80 miles an hour for freight. Either way, this means that a 400-mile corridor could be served in 6 hours or less with stops included, which is already faster than driving, which would take closer to 7 hours, assuming no stops and no traffic, and assuming you go the speed limit. If you do like 120 in a car and don't get caught by the highway patrol, I mean, good luck to you on that one. So if the track were upgraded to like 90 miles an hour, as I said, the 400-mile corridor would be served around closer to 5 hours. And we'll point out these are not high-speed trains. And frankly, other than this, I'm not really going to bring them up that much in this video. High-speed trains would be nice to have, but are not necessary to drive ridership in the U.S. And driving ridership is a greater public benefit, whether it's for traffic reduction on highways, reducing congestion at airports, reducing air pollution, or reducing our net carbon emissions. Having trains travel 400 miles in 2 hours would be nice, but generally speaking isn't going to be the thing that's going to drive people away from cars. As to why high-speed rail isn't necessary on the outset, let's look at some average travel speeds in the U.S. According to a study from about 20 years ago, the average commute speed in the United States was around 32 miles an hour, and again, this was in like 2003, so it's probably gotten worse before COVID hit at least. On top of this, the average highway speed ranges from 46 miles an hour around DC to around 70 miles an hour in rural states like Mississippi and Nevada, where there is nobody living and no traffic to interfere with the speed that you can drive. And again, these aren't commute speeds. This is a study done by TomTom around 2010, based on their users before Google Maps pretty much wiped them out. Showed that in more populated areas where trains would be more attractive, that the average highway speed is actually closer to 60 miles an hour, which doesn't sound like much, but it means that outside of rush hour, average traffic speeds don't generally hit the posted speed limit of 65 in most of the United States, which means that a train traveling around 80 miles an hour is going to be faster than driving outside of rush hour and dramatically faster than driving during rush hour. This means that trains would be competitive without having to go twice the posted speed limit at minimum to attract people. And the average long distance car trip and train trip is about 190 miles, so just under 200. The average bus trip is about 290 miles. So with Class 4 tracks, these trips can be done in 2.5 to 3.5 hours, which on the low end is at least an hour faster than the car, at least on the 2.5 hour trip. And the bus trip could take closer to 6 hours, given traffic and how much slower buses tend to go than people driving. So let's get into the cost of what it would take to upgrade the national network, and it would just frankly depend on how much we're willing to put into them. So the upper cost of rehabbing a mile of double track is $2.6 million, with $400,000 for new traffic control system, which we would need if we were doing this. So reason being is if the entire rail network was publicly owned, you'd need to have the same traffic control system-wide. And if you're upgrading the tracks, you might as well do the signals and the positive train control all at the same time, which would average to around $3 million a mile. Yeah, and I know bridges, tunnels, and mountains all confound this cost and would make it more, but just for the sake of doing a rolling average, upgrading the 93,000 or so miles of the Class 1 railroads would cost $279 billion in total. And if this was done over 5 years, or at least 5 years of funding it, Congress would have to put up about $55.8 billion a year again, for only 5 years. This doesn't mean that every mile would be upgraded, but this would be an approximate amount of money needed to get the rail network into a double-tracked state of good repair. This doesn't include much, if any, upgrades for passenger trains, assuming other than double tracking would be enough, because in some areas of the country it would be. If the tracks were nationalized, which would be needed since the railroads aren't going to modernize their network themselves because of property taxes and the debt that would be needed. Nationalizing the railways, assuming all of their quote-unquote property on their balance sheets is their right-of-way, at least as far as I have been able to adjust it, and absorb about $40 billion in debt from the Class 1s would mean that approximately $243 billion would be needed to purchase the rights of way and do some debt swaps. And this is assuming that they only take cash and not anything else, like any exclusive use deals or any guaranteed time slots. And if this was paid out over 20 years, it would cost about $14.6 billion a year. And upgrading passenger services would also be something that would be needed, but would require also more money on top of that, and a lot of money, mostly for rolling stock. But if the railways were nationalized and upgraded, the cost of actually doing the work would come down, because the upgrades I mentioned before would be more for freight than for passengers. But having extra capacity would also just help for Amtrak services in parts of the country that don't tend to have that great a service now, or service at all. So in this proposal, I would assume that about $40 billion would be needed for extra tracking, mostly to triple track certain segments of the network, probably around 30,000 miles, for trains to probably be going in each direction more than once an hour. And about $64 billion would be needed to purchase new rolling stock, which I would break down as about 1,500 Viewliner cars, 1,500 Superliners, 2,000 cars split between bi-levels, and single-level cars for interstate services, and then around 5,000 cars for state-supported services or state systems. This number I arrived at under the assumption California would have at least 600 to itself, and then calculated what that would mean per capita from there. And this does not include any potential replacement for the Amfleet 1s, the Amfleet 2s, and assumed that the 70 options that they still have from CAF would get used at some point, which under this assumption, Amtrak would have a fleet of approximately 11,000 cars and over 2,000 locomotives. Whether or not the state pools, by the way, are owned by the DOTs or not, this wouldn't be relevant, since I would also mandate that Amtrak would have to operate state-level networks even if the states don't really want to take part in this, and then basing that off of what their systems were in the 30s or some other point, and then just figuring out from there what would make good sense as far as travel markets are concerned. One of the main, and this brings us on to the topic of the Obama years, and thanks Obama, one of the main failures of his presidency, at least as far as Amtrak is concerned, is that the states lost their 403B funding, which was basically the federal government partially paid for some of the local services, and by partially I mean mostly, and they got rid of that and expected the states to cooperate and keep paying for any services under 750 miles in length. And since this has happened, Amtrak has lost a route. A few projects have been canceled, but mostly the Milwaukee to Madison extension, Ohio's is 3C project, and this is also, at least in my opinion, slowed down the expansion of services in North Carolina and Virginia and Pennsylvania, basically the entire country other than California, because Amtrak California is now a local concern because the state just can't be bothered. So the map I will be hopefully popping up on screen is what I would expect the maximum extent of the state networks would be, or state supported or state whatever networks. So this would also require changing some things about how Amtrak would work and is funded. As mentioned before, you would need to get rid of the 750-mile rule and replace it with what I would say is a much more complicated, but probably a much more, well, at least in my opinion, a much fairer system. So prior to I'm assuming it's just called PREA, the state-supported corridors used to get about 2/3 of their operating funding from the federal government, and the states would just make the feds would make the states basically pay for the remaining 33% that didn't come from revenue, to which I would bring back a similar setup, and basically I would assume that 50% is going to be paid for by the feds, and the other 50% would be paid for either by the states or through revenue, and that at least for the first 6 years of operating of the state networks, I would assume that the feds would be paying for all of the cost overruns, or not cost overruns, but just what it falls short between revenue and this federal money and the total operating costs. I would also add minimum levels of service, so if a route is less than 4 hours from end to end, it must start off with at least 4 round trips a day, and if it's over 5 hours, to start off with at least 2, along with having basic amenities like having a cafe car, business class, checked baggage service, preferably at every station. And the map kind of shows where I would put where I would run the services, but not necessarily each individual route. And basically every state except for, I believe, Idaho is not Idaho, Rhode Island is the one state that didn't get any extra services because it's so tiny, and the Northeast Corridor basically serves its entire population, whereas a few states just get extensions from its neighbors, and mostly Nebraska, Idaho, and Nevada just getting extensions from the neighboring states into it. And I think West Virginia too. So the other segment or section of tracks or quality of trains or whatever that I would set up are the interstate quote-unquote corridors, and basically this is the entire network that I would create, excluding a few overnight trains that run basically the combined routes of two trains, which hopefully I'll remember to throw that map in. But basically, like, there'd be one from Chicago to Denver, which would, at least on this map, take up 2 routes, which would also mean the creation of 41 corridors on this map and reclassifying the Palmetto, the Vermonter, and the Carolinian as interstate routes rather than as long-distance routes. And as far as service level goes, I try to have it be where it's at least three or 4 daytime trips if it's under 4 hours from end to end, at least after upgrades, 2 daytime trips and an overnight trip if it's like in the 6-ish hour ranges, and if it's 8 hours or more, but not up to 24 or, well, 12 or whatever would be convenient, have a daytime and an overnight trip. And basically on this map, excluding some of the longer distance western trips like the one in Nevada, all of these routes are over 300 miles and serve multiple states, and my standard for interstate would be where at least 26% of the route miles are in one state or it runs through more states, where not a majority of the route is in one of the states, so 55%. And basically same kind of service levels as the local trains, except for having a budget sleeping option on the night trains, and along with its standard sleepers, and basically just not expecting the states to really kick in much, if anything, of this. So basically the whole 55% rule would more or less exclude Michigan's state-supported routes from being considered interstate routes, because they mostly run in Michigan. Even though they do run through Indiana and Illinois a little bit, they still, again, are overwhelmingly majority of which of their mileage is in Michigan. So it would still stay in Michigan would still be, counting as that. Or actually on this map, I basically just assume the entirety of the Midwest, or Amtrak Midwest, would be just one gigantic service. Same thing with the Northeast. It would just be like one gigantic service, which finally at the end brings us to the long distance trains, or the national network. So as for the national network, which is basically everything except for the state routes, I would give the NEC, the Northeast Corridor, $50 billion just to keep their capital programs going, and basically add a crap load of more long distance trains. And I can't remember how many I would add exactly. So if I'm counting the map correctly, I would add about 20 new long-distance services to the country, which more or less will double it, along with getting all of them to run at least twice a day instead of the once-a-day crap that we currently have, and 3 times a week on 2 of them, at least pre-COVID. Again, schedules have been cut to 3 times a week on all of them but the auto train. And this is where we get into like some of the rest of the money that I would devote for the national network. So I'd put about $12 billion into new stations, which, for the sake of full disclosure, I have no idea how much it costs to build one station, and from what I've gathered, it can cost anywhere from $5 to $30 million depending on how big it is, because for whatever reason there's just not a lot of good records of this online, probably because we don't build that many in this country. And I would expect service to expand to like 600 to 1,200 new stations over the current 500, which would mean on top of this, they'd have to add like more maintenance facilities like their one at Beech Grove and Bear, Delaware, and other smaller maintenance facilities for the various trains around the country. I try to assume it had at least another $2 billion. And then we start getting into the hard part, which is training, recruiting and training people, which is always going to be the hard part with most business operations. Considering the U.S. is in a shortage of people with industrial skills, Amtrak would likely have to work with the local community colleges to recruit and train people to work in these facilities. Amtrak has industrial workers in fields such as metalworking, machinists, electrical workers, plumbers, and mechanical engineers. These are well-paying jobs that this country tends to undervalue and tends to not even tell people about at all at any point in their education. It might even be worth it for Amtrak to work with schools and high schools, at least in areas historically cut off from opportunities, and linking them with programs at community colleges. Another reason to work with high schools in excluded areas would be to recruit people for jobs that don't necessarily require advanced training, partially for the same reason. One thing that the post office is known for is giving immigrants and other people from disadvantaged backgrounds, including some of my relatives, an opportunity at a decent life. Amtrak, if it were expanding, should strive to do the same thing. The only way to break generational poverty and or disadvantages is for one generation to have a chance. Jobs that don't really require advanced training, as far as I know, at least more than Amtrak would give them, would be like onboard services, coach cleaning, and other services behind the scenes like food prep and laundry people. And the total impact of this would be like $180 billion for Amtrak, or total cost rather. So the economic impact of a project of this scope would be immense. Based on statistics from the American, I think it's APTA. I can't remember what the exact acronym is on the top of my head. My idiot self forgot to put that in the notes. But anyways, they studied the impact of commuter rail on the economy, showing that the rail has a very positive impact on the economy, even if the investment is very small and only ends up with a few trains running a day during peak hours only. Extrapolating their findings to a project of this scale, based on the total spending of $459 billion on infrastructure, the total impact for social issues would be $680 billion, and this would be mostly reducing road traffic, so less highway maintenance, money people would be saving overall from not driving, and overall reductions in pollution, and just total reduction of like the economic loss to traffic, which is actually getting bigger every year faster than our economy is actually growing. So fun fact on that. The total economic impact could be as high as 1.3 trillion. On the economic front, I say up to because studies are based on commuter rail, and 2/3 or so of what I would be proposing here is just track work for freight operators, and there would be an impact, from all the stuff being bought to actually do all that work. But from what I can gather, I can't really find a good study showing what the impact would be on that front. All in all, this would lead to around 3.6 million jobs being created or supported by this project, and then that would further ripple out through the economy, through them spending money and the people, the companies doing all the work buying stuff, which leads me to the economic note of the velocity of money, which is a concept from economics, which is the number of times cash changes hands in economy at large. In the US, that number is close to 2, which means basically every piece of money in existence changes hands twice per year. The economic impact would be greater than the money being spent because the contractor, has to hire people and buy stuff, and then those people go and buy stuff, so the money just kind of moves through the economy through their spending. They buy stuff, the employees buy stuff, the employees of the companies the other companies are buying from buy stuff, which is rippled on through the economy, supporting more and more jobs. So the question some people would have, mostly conservatives, would be, would this cause inflation? And the answer is it kind of depends. Since the US doesn't have a commodity currency, inflation is not based on how much money exists in the entire economy, at least not exclusively. It is mostly a function of demand within the economy. So prices might rise, but that would mostly be in the affected sectors, which probably wouldn't cause economy-wide inflation, maybe a little bit, because if there's more people working and more people buying stuff, there would be more demand in total, which might drive a slight amount of inflation. But since, construction industries take a hit after a recession, and a 5 to 10 year spending plan would spread out all of this consumption, it probably wouldn't lead to much, if any, inflation over what we could expect. And a side note, inflation actually, since the 2008 crash, has actually been lower than expected. Like normally the Fed and economists and finance people expect about 2% a year, and inflation has generally been well below that, which is actually concerning for a lot of reasons that are generally beyond the scope of this video, mostly including that people are just not spending money because we really can't afford to. But, fun. Again, not in the purview of this video. So which kind of, gets us to the how you're going to pay for it part of it. So the total cost of this would be $702 billion, and given that corporations in the United States make $8 trillion a year in profits, paying for this whole project over 5 years translates to around 1.8% of their profits. And if we made this a permanent 2% tax and devoted the revenue to public transportation, this would mean around $160 billion available for public transit, which I would split this between 20% to Amtrak, 20% to regional and commuter rail for their capital projects. Amtrak would this is capital all the way, not like actual operating money. The National Rail Network, 20% to keep them, their projects going, and then the rest of it, which is 40% going to general public transit. And based on 2019 profit figures, this would give Amtrak, regional rail operators, and the National Rail Network $34.8 billion each in capital funds and $69.6 for other forms of public transportation. I would also limit that the Amtrak money can't all just be spent on the Northeast Corridor, which would be their first impulse. I would basically say, but no more than 10% of it could be spent in any one year, and that the capital funds for regional rail will be subjected to a formula prioritizing systems that will have the most day-to-day service or most daytime service, will take the most people off the road, or reduced vehicle miles driven per capita by the greatest amount. And I'll save what I would do for the public transit part for a little bit later, because that's a slightly different subject. So the point of this is the economic impact would be immense. The difference between this and highway projects is that the environmental and social impact, but society and the environment would also be impacted in a more positive way. The social impact being shifting people away from driving everywhere and shifting people back to trains and other forms of transportation. Expanding public transit is also one of the other ways to boost economic prosperity to people who are, poor, mostly because affordable and frankly more useful public transit means people can get to job interviews, business meetings, see families, go to events, and other such activities, which not only enriches themselves but also enriches the economy at large. Not to mention people being able to visit family, friends, and go out of town makes people happier, which is something our society is in desperate need of. And if one thing has happened over the last 40 years, it's been the decline of family and social connections, mostly because we need to work, because we haven't really gotten a pay raise above inflation since the 80s. And the other reason being, do you really want to drive 4 hours or so on a Friday night after work through traffic to see a friend you haven't seen in a couple of years? I for certain have made that decision against traveling because the train only ran once a day and it wasn't running at a time that was convenient for me, and I was tired after work, even after only doing a half day, and I just didn't make the trip. But if Amtrak were an option, or at least a more convenient one, I would have made the trip instead of just staying home. So the environmental impact is something that is also going to be immense and kind of deserve its own little blurb. So Hopefully I'll remember to throw the math up here. But the average car, assuming that it's like a Toyota Corolla, produces 23.3 grams of carbon dioxide per passenger mile. A train hauled by a Genesis locomotive produces 16.7 grams of CO2 per passenger mile. And an electric train, for hypothetical comparison based on the US electrical grid, assuming it's about as efficient as, one of the German intercity trains, would produce about 14.1 grams of CO2 per passenger mile. Also, I have to note that I couldn't find out how much more efficient the Genesis locomotive or the Charger locomotives that are replacing the Genesis engines are over each other. I've heard that it mentioned that the Chargers are actually twice as efficient as the Genesis locomotives, but I can't really confirm that, and that would also cut the emissions roughly in half. But since I can't confirm that, grains of salt. Which kind of brings us to the idea, like the topic of electrification. It is, and I hate to disappoint the environmentalists, rail advocates. Honestly, no, I don't. It frankly wouldn't be a good use of capital, public capital for U.S. railways, should we get any. Most freight railways, for whatever reason, are just not going to convert to electric operations. I can't really understand why. I guess I just can't imagine, having the pantograph and the containery being high enough to let your double stacks through, I guess. And even on the Northeast Corridor, freight railways still do run diesel engines under the electric wire, and it's actually like a long enough route where you actually probably should just use a freaking electric engine. Me ranting about that is not going to really change anything, so we'll just kind of move on. And also, not to mention how dirty our grid is, considering that we get like 63% of our electricity from carbon dioxide. It's, again, not going to be that much better. Assuming that, the railways even bother to buy electric engines, should we actually electrify them, which is kind of an if. So from a capital perspective, electrification now for the most part wouldn't make much sense given how expensive electrification is in the US. Based on the numbers from Caltrain's electrification, the cost would be floating around $12 million a mile, which, best case scenario, we only do about 20 to 30,000 miles of electrification, which would add 280 to 372 billion on top of what we would already be spending to do the basic track work and signaling work. And this is under the assumption that the Caltrain costs are actually representative of what a larger scale electrification project would be. And if I can figure out these numbers, a Republican-backed think tank could do it and try to kill the whole deal, assuming the Democrats wouldn't just compromise this to death on their own. Electrifying the railways also, as a part of the initial push, would also avoid and possibly sidestep all the potential economies of scale of doing 30,000 or 20,000 miles of it in one shot and planning and taking more time to actually plan that out. Would achieve overdoing 200-mile segments every decade or so, or what would most likely be done if we were doing this all in one, doing this electrification all now would be 200-mile stretches for commuter rails only, and maybe only 70 miles of a track being electrified, which, if Denver RTD is anything to go by, Amtrak doesn't use electric engines under their wires. They just sidestep them and just go on the freight line. So, having 70 miles of electric with, on a 1,200 plus mile trip is not really going to be useful for Amtrak or the freight railways, again, assuming they even bother to use them. One way to make these projects cheaper, at least in volume, would be to do them with more regularity, and that's one of the things the U.S. doesn't do with public transit other than roads, meaning that holding off electrifying the railways till 2035, 2040, and then using the time in between then and now to plan this project out and figure out which of the 31,000 miles or maximum would make the most sense to convert. It would just be overall cheaper and we could possibly get that per mile cost from 12 million, maybe cut it in half. Because I do think in Europe it actually is significantly cheaper, but then again, in Europe they're actually putting up, electric railways regularly, unlike us. So basically every electrification project that it goes on now requires the contractor to hire people, train people to do something that is fairly specialized, just for them to do the work once and be fired once the project is done. The same thing actually happens with making rolling stock for railways in the United States. Basically, you have to hire a bunch of people to do one job and then fire them all after 2 to 5 years. So this leads contractors having to spend money to train people, hire people, money to set up the logistics because of Buy America requirements, which aren't going away at all, which I don't really think they should anyways, and then probably some money to convince a bunch of regulators that this project is safe and doable and, not some pie in the sky thing that we just cannot do because this is America and we just don't do things anymore. And all this money would effectively be spent for what is going to be a one-off specialized project. And generally speaking, specialized goods and services cost more than just buying something conventional, which is kind of why we stick with diesel. And making this a more regular project would actually bring those costs down and make things more, and basically make electrifying railways a normal thing, which again, given how much we would need to do and how much it costs, it would make more sense to wait a little few years and then do a bunch than to do like I said, a few hundred miles here and there and then start doing it. So also just to think of it this way, what's cheaper to do, buying a set of dishes from a department store or trying to commission a custom set of dishes? A better solution with respects to greening the economy would be to convert the existing railways to biodiesel with an explicit plan to get our grid to zero emissions. Basically, by the time we would actually be starting the electrification, which I would shoot between 2035 and 2040, which I know Joe Biden has at least said he wants to have all of U.S. electricity be net zero by 2035. So basically, like when we're getting to the point of like net zero is when we should be like, this is how much and where we're going to electrify. So we're doing it all when it would make sense. And we have hopefully trained people to do all that. But biodiesel would frankly could be a better, I don't want to say would be, but could be a better short-term solution, since it would be something that the railways could wrap their heads around. But it also does get a fairly bad rap and gets called greenwashing because with current technology it wouldn't be carbon neutral or carbon negative, which environmentalists basically think to mean that it's just as bad as petrodiesel. And people like this generally are going to be the Green New Deal types, which say the only way forward is to electrify our entire grid with renewables by 2030, get everybody to go vegan, and then electrify everything else that we can thereafter. And if we can't electrify it, we'll just give up on it. The problem with this view of environmentalism is that it assumes that there's only one right answer to the climate crisis and that theirs is the only one true answer. The issue with the climate crisis is that we basically have 15 years or less to cut our emissions in half, and again, that number kind of gets smaller every so often, and then to basically weatherize our coastlines to deal with floods and storm surge. It doesn't really matter how we get to a 50% cut emissions so long as we do it within a given time frame, and biodiesel on average reduces net carbon emissions by 72%. And if we were to pick canola, which is from what I can gather the most productive thing we could try to replace petrodiesel with, and even airline jet fuel, it would cut net emissions by up to 90%. So to put this into a slightly different context, it would be like saying there being more vegetarians in the world won't help with the environment because beans have net carbon emissions like beef. Yes, biodiesel would still have some net emissions, but they would have significantly less net emissions than the alternative petrodiesel, just like eating beans and going vegetarian. If people did that on scale, or at least a much larger scale, that actually would have a small, if not, it would have a smaller impact than. Anyways, my point is that just because something still has like some net emissions doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. The issue with biodiesel, however, is whether or not we can grow enough of it, not whether or not it has lower carbon emissions. So here's some time for more math. For example, if we did pick canola oil to move forward with, we could replace most, if not all, of diesel consumption, but it would come at a cost. And again, these are US only numbers because again, US only channel. An acre of canola produces around 1,500 to 2,600 pounds per fuel, and we burn the equivalent of 327.5 billion pounds of diesel a year, which would mean that we need to devote 125.3 million to 217.2 million of acres of land in the United States to growing canola. Based on current land uses in the U.S., that means that we would need to devote all the land we currently grow animal feed on, all the land we currently use for biofuels, and about a tenth of the pasture land we currently use to graze dairy cows on to grow canola to meet diesel demand and maybe fuel planes. Also, I must note the spent canola seeds can actually be used as animal feed, so kind of a win-win there. You can kind of consolidate the two because it would just be a waste product of us trying to do fuel. So in theory, we could do it, but we'd have to change our ways. Meat consumption's already kind of going down anyways, so that problem might solve itself, but we'd also need to convince farmers that feeding animals canola, seeds and canola-based fuels is a good thing, and that we need to drastically reduce diesel emissions or diesel consumption, and that also convincing people and other environmentalists that reducing the net impact of diesel emissions would actually be better than putting ethanol in cars, which is kind of an if. And on top of that, getting more freight onto railways would also save a lot of fuel, which means we might have to give up one day shipping on Amazon, which, or pay a lot more for it, because God forbid we give up anything like that that level of convenient one day shipping. I'm not saying I've never used it. I'm just saying though, I'd give if it was one day shipping or the environment, frankly, I could live with waiting a couple days to get something. But my overall point is that as expanding Amtrak isn't a panacea, and neither is a Green New Deal or UBI or any other singular policy Congress could put in, but they can be vehicles to getting better outcomes in society. As mentioned, if Amtrak were to expand, it could prioritize recruiting people from areas that have been historically locked out of opportunities, which will help with economic inequality, even if it's only 100,000 people getting decent paying jobs. Some people might say that's too small of a scale, but just for comparison, that's more adults than live in the biggest city in my county, so that actually is still a lot of people. 100,000 may not seem like a lot, but at least doing something for some people would be helpful. I'm not shooting to solve every problem in society, just try to show that we can solve some. Expanding train services will also change how we live and could change how we live, since having train service will draw businesses and housing to where the stations are, and which would shift how people want to live, which according to Pew, about half the population actually wants to live in dense, quote-unquote, urban areas. Now, more is needed to change this setup than just getting trains to places, and zoning reform is a big one, such as changing commercial and residential zone to mixed-use zoning based on density and expanding local bus service. I mean, I'll just talk about them now. These reforms are something you need to do on a state level, and you just can't achieve at the city level, because city and county governments have an incentive to not change zoning laws, because the people that disproportionately vote are the people who own property and the people who benefit the most from the current setup. And this is the one thing that the progressive left in America continually fails to understand, because they just romanticize localism, is that there are certain jobs that certain levels of government should do, and we need to have a discussion about that in this country. Not every single thing that requires government action can just be devolved to the city, and where we just hope for the best, because we've tried this in California, and it frankly just leads to worse results and more money being spent to get worse results, which is just, frankly, I mean, as much as I am a lefty, I still do believe in good government, and I would rather have like 4 times the bus service for the same amount of money being spent than just being able to say, well, it's been locally controlled, so, we've exchanged that for a good bus, service. Anyways, things we could do to improve this, as I mentioned before, if we took like 2% of corporate profits and tax 2% of corporate profits and we're using it for public transit, and divided it between the states based on their population, I would add conditions to that funding, of which one would be changing zoning laws at the state level, or at least over a majority, or at least only give the money to, if you can't do it at the state level, to counties and cities that have changed their zoning laws to be compliant. And that would be changing residential and commercial zoning to being based on density and mixed use, instead of just being, well, this can only be single family houses, this can only be apartments, and so on and so on. And basically have 4 zones, which would be the downtown area, midtown, and transit areas, your primary, areas along primary roads where there'll be more transit, and then everything else. And then basically categorize city into 4 tiers based on their population, with each of the 4 tiers, each zone getting progressively more dense. Not to mention changing basing building approvals on their average vehicle miles traveled instead of how much local traffic they generate, along with base levels of bus service on arterial roads. Because in most suburban cities, frankly, an arterial road should have a bus running every 20 minutes between 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. Even when I lived in Nevada, they still managed to, along most of the arterial roads, have service every half an hour in that time frame. So, I mean, there's no excuse to not require that for federal funds. Requiring changes to zoning codes, basic public transit service levels, and development based on reducing vehicle miles would be a better way to leverage federal funds than just giving the states money and just hoping for the best, because localism is a virtue. Not to mention progressives just don't understand using leverage anyways, force the vote and all. There are other ways this initiative could help the environment besides just nudging, changing zoning laws. Having a rolling plan for electrification starting, after we get our grid more clean would reduce the cost, as I said. And I know MMT is a big thing with the progressive left, but that's not just a license to spend as much money as you want. There are limits. You can cause inflation if you try to buy more than your economy can produce in any given amount of time. And given how small the rail industry is in this country, or at least the industries that support it, trying to do too much at once could cause inflation, at least in those industries. So, trying to buy up more steel and concrete, rocks, and other whatnots that we may or may not be able to produce quickly. This can be reduced by spending, doing this during a recession like we are currently living through, or doing this over like a 100-year time scale, which is what Congress would want to do. But planning for and having a funding mechanism for electrification starting, give or take, by 2035, 2040 range would give the required industries time to develop in the United States. And the second point would be that electrification as a looming project, it would actually kind of kick the whole getting rid of, natural gas and coal, which is like 63% of our power, to go away. And just for reference, 18% is currently renewable and about 19% is nuclear. And hopefully those numbers total to 100. I frankly didn't do the math when I rounded this all, so grain of salt. To get the most bang for a buck, the grid would need to be largely, if not entirely, renewables when the electrification starts, or at least the planning. This also give us time to develop our railways and figure out where, again, to electrify first to get the most bang for the buck. And on the topic of trains, converting them to biodiesel in short term would reduce emissions, as I said, in a manner that the railways would find familiar. And this is assuming we could get it together enough to just pick a plant to fucking grow and plan for it, because planning, sometimes it's a good thing with your economy. Converting them in the short term will reduce emissions, but it would get a biofuels industry running, which would help other industries that really can't electrify as quickly. One of the big ones being the airline industry, because at this point flying is based on the plane being lighter when it lands than when it takes off, and the only way you can really do that is with a liquid fuel. I know electric planes are being developed, but from what I've seen, the ones that are most likely to get flying are going to basically be prop planes, which are really slow. But for jets, which will frankly still be around for a long time, they need something to combust, and from what I understand, canola oil could be used to replace jet fuel. And if we get fuel going for one industry, other industries with similar needs are likely going to embrace the fuel because it'll just be the easier option. And like I mentioned, electric planes will probably be prop planes at first, and those were generally slow. And prior to jet airliners, it could take 15 hours and a lot of turbulence just to cross the United States. So we're frankly not going to give up on jet travel anytime soon, let alone, across the country. We're still going to be flying cross country, let alone to other parts of the world. And one discourse around the Green New Deal is just never really brings up that. It kind of just assumes we'll high-speed rail everything. I mean, it'll take 18 hours to cross the country if you can do 200 miles the whole way, which frankly would suck. Like if you're stuck in a seat all day. But the more likely outcome of the Green New Deal, should we actually get something like that, which I sincerely doubt, would be that long distance transportations like jet airliners continuing on their current trajectory and possibly getting more expensive, or the electrified alternative being so slow and expensive that only really rich people would use it, which would more or less regress how we deal with like transportation by 100 miles. And travel was expensive prior to deregulation, partially due to regulations making travel expensive to make sure that there was enough money to pay for less profitable parts of the system. And the other part of it being is that the technology was just more expensive to deal with. The shortest is that it is well within our means to nationalize the rights of way in the United States, upgrade them, expand passenger trains, and use all of this to get the ball rolling on environmental and social issues. This includes dealing with the lack of opportunity in some communities, changing urban development to serve the half the population that wants to live in more dense urban areas, and greening other industries. Building TGVs won't change these things unless there's something being used as to leverage that change. One thing that people on the left don't understand is that local governments just have no incentive to do what they want, whether it's suburban homeowners not wanting an apartment building within 5 miles of them, or big city governments that care more about keeping big business and landlords happy because more housing is bad because it could drive down or stabilize rents. More apartments are bad because poor people are icky, and more buses just brings poor people in to steal my TV, which is what suburbanites at least tend to think. So the point is, if you want this to change, you need to use leverage to make this happen. And since states and local governments will pimp themselves out for like 10% federal funding, having a pool of money that can only be used or accessed by changing things is the only way to get better public transit, better urban development, than if we just give the cities money and just kind of hope for the best. And that's where I'm going to leave this one, because this is going to be a little longer than I've ever made. And I hope you enjoyed and come back for the next one. And, like, share, subscribes, all those fun stuffs, because, oh God, I'm just done with talking. See you later.